Miss Marple and the Challenge of Two Murders.
Chapter 1. Guests in the Garden. The village of St. Mary Mead was enjoying one of the most beautiful afternoons of the summer. The sky was bright blue, dotted with slow-moving white clouds. A gentle breeze carried the scent of roses through the quiet village lanes. Birds sang cheerfully from the hedges, and bees drifted lazily among the flowers. In the garden of a small cottage near the edge of the village, Miss Jane Marple was hard at work. Dressed in her familiar gardening clothes and wide-brimmed hat, she carefully inspected a row of rose bushes that had recently begun to bloom. She carried a small basket on her arm and a pair of pruning shears in her hand. To an outsider, Miss Marple appeared to be an ordinary elderly lady enjoying her retirement. The villagers knew better. Many years of observing human behavior had made her one of the sharpest minds in England. Criminals, liars, thieves, and even murderers had repeatedly underestimated her because of her harmless appearance. Miss Marple preferred it that way. As she clipped away a dead branch from one of her roses, she smiled to herself. Gardening and human nature were remarkably similar. A healthy garden required patience, observation, and attention to detail. The same was true of solving mysteries. A tiny weed ignored today could become a major problem tomorrow. Likewise, a small lie often grew into something far more dangerous. She moved to another flower bed where bright red roses stood beside rows of lavender. Nearby, a robin hopped confidently across the lawn. Miss Marple watched it for a moment. "You're becoming rather bold," she said softly. The robin tilted its head as though considering her words. Just then, the peaceful afternoon was interrupted by the distant sound of an approaching motorcar. Miss Marple straightened and listened. Visitors. A few moments later, a large automobile appeared on the lane outside her cottage. She smiled immediately. Only one person drove quite so confidently through the village, her nephew, Raymond West. The car stopped outside the gate. The front door opened. Raymond climbed out first, tall, cheerful, and energetic. He was a successful writer who frequently visited his aunt whenever he could escape London. "Aunt Jane," he called. Miss Marple waved. "My dear Raymond." Raymond hurried through the gate and kissed her cheek. "It is wonderful to see you." "And you," Miss Marple replied. Then more passengers emerged from the automobile. Raymond's wife Joan stepped out first. Elegant and warm-hearted, Joan had always enjoyed visiting St. Mary Mead. Behind her came three unfamiliar guests. A tall gentleman with silver hair and spectacles, a younger man carrying a leather briefcase, and a woman with short dark hair whose alert eyes seemed to notice everything around her. Raymond introduced them one by one. "Aunt Jane, may I present Professor Leonard Hart?" The professor bowed politely. "A pleasure, Miss Marple. And this is David Collins." The younger man smiled. "Delighted to meet you. How do you do?" And finally, Margaret Wells. The dark-haired woman shook Miss Marple's hand warmly. "I've heard a great deal about you." Miss Marple smiled. "I hope not too much." Everyone laughed. The visitors carried their luggage inside, while Raymond remained behind in the garden. He glanced around appreciatively. "The roses look magnificent. They have behaved rather well this year." "Unlike people," Miss Marple chuckled. "People are rarely as cooperative as roses," Raymond laughed. "That sounds like the beginning of one of your investigations." "Perhaps." As they walked toward the cottage, Miss Marple noticed something interesting. Professor Hart appeared thoughtful and analytical. David Collins seemed confident and argumentative. Margaret Wells observed everything carefully. Each visitor revealed a little about themselves through the way they moved, spoke, and looked at their surroundings. Most people never realized how much they revealed. Inside the cottage, tea was soon served. The guests settled comfortably in the sitting room, before eventually moving outside into the garden. For the next hour, they enjoyed tea, cakes, and pleasant conversation. The discussion wandered from politics to literature, and eventually to crime. That subject immediately caught Miss Marple's attention. Professor Hart leaned back in his chair. "I've always been fascinated by unsolved mysteries." "So have I," said Margaret. "As a journalist, I've covered several." David smiled. "The difficulty is separating facts from assumptions." "Very true," Miss Marple said quietly. The professor nodded. "Most investigations fail because people accept assumptions as facts." Miss Marple looked interested. "An excellent observation," Raymond grinned. "Careful, Professor. My aunt may begin interrogating you." Everyone laughed again. The conversation continued throughout the afternoon. Stories of famous criminals, impossible robberies, and mysterious disappearances followed one another. Several times Miss Marple contributed small comments. Each time her observations seemed surprisingly insightful. Margaret noticed it. "So many of your examples come from village life." Miss Marple nodded. "Human nature is the same everywhere. Even murderers, especially murderers." The group laughed, though Professor Hart seemed thoughtful. As evening approached, long shadows stretched across the garden. The guests retired to their rooms to prepare for dinner. Miss Marple remained outside for a few moments. She watered her roses slowly while considering her visitors. Professor Hart interested her. He seemed intelligent, perhaps too intelligent. People who valued cleverness often overlooked simple truths. David Collins appeared competitive. He liked proving himself right. Margaret Wells possessed curiosity and patience, useful qualities. And Raymond, as always, enjoyed gathering interesting people together. A pleasant weekend seemed likely. Yet Miss Marple had learned something long ago. Interesting people often brought interesting problems. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, she returned inside. Dinner proved delightful. The guests exchanged stories and laughed frequently. Afterward, they gathered in the sitting room around a warm fire. Outside, light rain began tapping against the windows. The atmosphere felt cozy and peaceful. Professor Hart sipped his coffee and suddenly smiled. "I believe," he said, "that tonight presents a rare opportunity." Everyone looked toward him. "What sort of opportunity?" asked Joan. The professor set down his cup. "A challenge." Immediately, the room became interested. David leaned forward. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Even Raymond looked curious. Professor Hart's smile widened. "For many years I have collected accounts of unusual crimes." "Go on," said Raymond. "Among them are 2 murders so baffling that nearly everyone who hears them fails to identify the killers." The room became silent. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Professor Hart looked around the group. Would anyone care to test their powers of deduction? The challenge had been issued, and before the night was over, 2 impossible murders would place everyone in the room against one very observant old lady. Chapter 2. The First Impossible Murder. The rain continued to fall softly outside Miss Marple's cottage. Inside, the sitting room glowed with warmth and comfort. The fire crackled gently in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Cups of coffee rested on small tables, and everyone had settled comfortably into their chairs. Professor Leonard Hart looked around the room with a smile. "You have all accepted my challenge." "Absolutely," said David Collins confidently. Margaret Wells nodded. "I haven't solved a murder yet, but I intend to start tonight." Raymond laughed. "You may regret saying that if Aunt Jane decides to join the competition." Miss Marple smiled modestly. "Oh, I am merely an interested listener." The professor leaned forward. "Very well. Let me tell you about a murder that baffled investigators for years." The room grew silent. 5 years ago, he began, a wealthy businessman named Arthur Pembroke was found dead in his private study. The professor paused dramatically. At first glance, it appeared to be suicide. David nodded. "Many murders do." "Indeed," said the professor, "but this case was different," he continued. Arthur Pembroke owned a successful shipping company and lived alone in a large country house called Hawthorne Manor. He was respected, wealthy, and apparently in good health. "What happened?" asked Margaret. On the evening of October 14th, Pembroke retired to his study shortly after dinner. Several servants saw him enter the room at approximately 8 o'clock. The professor folded his hands. No one saw him alive again. A gust of wind rattled the cottage windows. The atmosphere in the room suddenly felt more mysterious. The next morning, the professor continued, his secretary, Miss Helen Price, arrived for work. She knocked on the study door but received no answer. "Was that unusual?" asked Raymond. "Very. Pembroke was known for punctuality." The professor nodded. When repeated knocking produced no response, the servants became concerned. "What happened then?" Joan asked. "They attempted to open the door, and it was locked." Everyone exchanged glances. "Locked from inside?" David asked. "Apparently so." The professor took a sip of coffee. After several unsuccessful attempts, the butler fetched a heavy iron tool. Together they broke down the door. "And found the body?" Margaret asked quietly. "Exactly. The professor's voice dropped slightly. Arthur Pembroke was lying beside his desk. Dead. Dead. The room remained silent. A revolver was found near his hand. He had been shot once through the chest. That certainly sounds like suicide, David said. So the police initially believed. The professor smiled. However, several details quickly raised doubts. Miss Marple remained silent, knitting quietly. The professor continued. First, Pembroke had recently purchased tickets for a lengthy holiday abroad. Not something a suicidal man usually does, Margaret observed. Quite right. Anything else? Asked Raymond. Several witnesses stated he had been in excellent spirits. David frowned. Still not enough to rule out suicide. No, agreed the professor. But then the doctor examined the body. And? The bullet entered at a very unusual angle. David sat up straighter. Interesting. The doctor believed it would have been extremely difficult for Pembroke to fire the weapon himself. A murmur moved through the room. Now it becomes murder, Margaret said. Precisely. The professor nodded. The police began investigating. Who were the suspects? Asked Joan. There were 4. The professor raised 4 fingers. First, Edward Crane. Who was he? Pembroke's business partner, the professor explained. Although the company appeared successful, Crane had recently argued with Pembroke about finances. David nodded thoughtfully. A financial motive. Exactly. The professor raised a second finger. Robert Pembroke. The nephew? Yes. Let me guess, Raymond said. Inheritance. Correct. The professor smiled. Robert was heavily in debt and stood to inherit a substantial fortune. Margaret immediately looked suspicious. He sounds promising. The professor raised a third finger. Helen Price. The secretary who found the body? Asked Joan. The same. What motive did she have? She had recently learned that Pembroke intended to dismiss her. Margaret nodded slowly. Another possibility. The professor raised his final finger. Thomas Bell, the gardener. Everyone looked surprised. The gardener, David repeated. Indeed. Why him? Pembroke planned to sell part of the estate, including the cottage where Bell's family had lived for decades. The room grew thoughtful. 4 suspects, 4 motives, a locked room, a dead man, the ingredients of an impossible mystery. Professor Hart leaned back. Now we arrive at the truly puzzling part. Everyone waited. The study had only 1 door and 1 window? David guessed. Yes. Were both locked? Both. Margaret frowned. Could someone have escaped through the window? The professor shook his head. The window was locked from the inside. Hidden passage? Raymond suggested. No hidden passages. David crossed his arms. What about the servants? The police investigated thoroughly. No accomplices? None. The professor smiled. The murderer appeared to vanish. Silence settled over the room. Outside, rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, everyone was thinking. David spoke first. I suspect the nephew. Why? Asked Margaret. Debt. She shook her head. Too obvious. What about the business partner? Joan suggested. Financial disputes often lead to murder. Margaret disagreed. I prefer the secretary. Everyone turned toward her. Because she discovered the body? Exactly. Discovering a body is sometimes convenient. David laughed. That isn't evidence. No, Margaret admitted. But it interests me. Raymond leaned forward. What about the gardener? Nobody seemed convinced. For nearly half an hour, theories flew around the room. Each suspect was examined, each motive discussed. Each possibility eventually collapsed. The locked room remained impossible. Finally, David sighed. I give up. Margaret laughed. So do I. Joan shook her head. I cannot make any of it fit. Raymond looked toward the professor. I assume there is a solution. Oh yes, the professor smiled. There most certainly is. His eyes moved slowly toward Miss Marple. She was still knitting calmly. The room followed his gaze. Miss Marple looked up. My dear professor, have you formed an opinion? Everyone waited. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. For a moment she remained silent. Then she smiled. Actually, yes. The professor's eyes brightened. And? I believe the murderer was Helen Price. Margaret sat upright immediately. The secretary? David looked astonished. But how? The professor smiled very slowly. It was the smile of a man who knew the answer and suspected he was about to hear something remarkable. Miss Marple folded her hands. My conclusion depends upon a very simple observation. The room became completely silent. "What observation?" asked Raymond. Miss Marple looked around the gathering. "My dear friends, everyone has been asking the wrong question." And with those words, she prepared to reveal the first step towards solving the impossible murder. Chapter 3. Miss Marple solves the first murder. The sitting room fell completely silent. Outside, rain continued to fall against the cottage windows. Inside, every eye was fixed upon Miss Marple. Professor Hart leaned forward with obvious interest. "You believe Helen Price murdered Arthur Pembroke?" "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. David Collins frowned. "But she discovered the body." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. Margaret Wells smiled. "I had my suspicions about her." Miss Marple nodded. "A very sensible suspicion." Professor Hart folded his arms. "You mentioned that everyone was asking the wrong question. I believe they were." "And what is the correct question?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Professor, everyone has been asking how the murderer escaped from the locked room, naturally. But no one has asked whether the murderer needed to escape at all." The room became quiet again. David blinked. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple settled comfortably into her chair. "We have accepted one very important assumption. The room was locked when the murder occurred," Margaret said slowly. "Precisely." Professor Hart's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Miss Marple continued, "Yet have we any proof that the room was locked at the moment Arthur Pembroke died?" Nobody answered. Professor Hart smiled slightly. "Continue. The servants saw Mr. Pembroke enter the study at 8 o'clock. Correct. The body was discovered the following morning. Also correct." Miss Marple nodded. "That leaves many hours unaccounted for." David leaned forward. "But the door was locked." "Yes, when the body was discovered." The emphasis on the final words caught everyone's attention. Margaret suddenly sat upright. "You're saying the room may not have been locked all night?" "Exactly." The journalist stared at Miss Marple. "Good heavens." Raymond smiled. "I think Aunt Jane has found something." Professor Hart remained silent. His expression suggested he was enjoying every moment. Miss Marple continued. "Imagine that Arthur Pembroke met someone privately in his study." "The secretary?" Joan suggested. "Perhaps." "They argue." Miss Marple nodded. "A very serious argument." David was listening carefully now. "The secretary knew she was about to lose her position." "Yes. She also possessed a key to the study." "Indeed." Miss Marple smiled. "The key is very important." She paused. "Suppose she confronted Pembroke that evening. What happened?" Margaret asked. Miss Marple folded her hands. "They argued about something more significant than dismissal." Professor Hart raised an eyebrow. "What would that be?" "The missing document." The professor smiled but said nothing. Everyone noticed. Miss Marple had struck an important point. She continued. "The missing document suggests motive." "Financial motive?" David asked. "Most likely." Miss Marple nodded. "Helen Price worked closely with company records." The professor remained silent. His silence was becoming increasingly revealing. Miss Marple continued. "Perhaps she had been stealing information." "Or money," Margaret suggested. "Possibly." "Pembroke discovers the truth." "Exactly." The old lady nodded. A confrontation follows. The room remained completely still. "Then she shoots him," Raymond said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. "I believe so." David frowned. "But the locked room remains." "Only because we insist on creating it." Everyone looked puzzled. Miss Marple smiled. "The room became locked later." Professor Hart's smile widened. Margaret stared. "Of course." David looked confused. "What do you mean?" Margaret answered, before Miss Marple could. "Helen discovered the body." David nodded. So? "So she controlled the situation." The realization slowly spread through the room. Miss Marple continued. "After killing Pembroke, she leaves the study, using her key." "Precisely." "Then what?" "She waits." Everyone listened carefully. "The next morning she returns." David's eyes widened. "Before anyone else arrives." "Exactly." Miss Marple nodded. "She locks the door from outside." The room fell silent. "Then she raises the alarm," Margaret whispered. "Yes." Professor Hart slowly applauded. A single clap. Then another. Then another. The sound echoed through the room. "Brilliant." Everyone looked toward him. Professor Hart was smiling broadly. "You have reconstructed the essential solution." Raymond laughed. "I knew it." David shook his head. "Extraordinary." Joan smiled. It seems so obvious now, Miss Marple chuckled. Mysteries often do. Professor Hart leaned forward. There is more. Miss Marple nodded. I suspected as much. The professor stood and walked toward the fireplace. When police finally solved the case years later, they discovered that Helen Price had indeed been stealing confidential company information. Margaret looked satisfied. The document. Yes, Professor Hart nodded. Arthur Pembroke learned what she had been doing and threatened to expose her. Precisely. The professor turned toward Miss Marple. She confronted him in the study, shot him, then left the room. Everyone listened carefully. The next morning she returned before the servants became active, locked the study, raised the alarm, and created the illusion of a locked room murder. Professor Hart smiled. Exactly. David let out a long breath. The police spent months trying to discover how the killer escaped, Miss Marple smiled. Because the killer never escaped. The room erupted with laughter. Even Professor Hart laughed. The simplicity of the answer made it seem almost absurd. After a few moments, the room settled again. Raymond poured more coffee. I must ask, Aunt Jane. Yes, dear? How did you recognize it so quickly? Miss Marple smiled. It reminded me of Mrs. Fletcher's missing silver teapot. Everyone looked confused. Professor Hart laughed. I should have known. Margaret smiled. Please explain. Miss Marple nodded. Many years ago, Mrs. Fletcher accused nearly everyone in the village of stealing her silver teapot. What happened? The teapot was eventually found. Where? In her attic. The room laughed. But that isn't the important part. What is? David asked. Miss Marple smiled. Everyone assumed the teapot had disappeared on Tuesday. And it hadn't? No, it disappeared on Sunday. Professor Hart laughed loudly. The same mistake. Exactly. Miss Marple nodded. An incorrect assumption created an impossible mystery. Margaret shook her head admiringly. You solve crimes by studying people. I try. The professor returned to his chair. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple has solved the first impossible murder. Raymond raised his coffee cup. To Aunt Jane. Everyone lifted their cups. To Miss Marple. The old lady blushed slightly. You are all very kind. Professor Hart smiled mysteriously. But I wonder if Miss Marple will be quite so successful with the second case. David laughed. There's another one? Oh yes. The professor's eyes gleamed. And this one is considerably more difficult. Outside, the rain grew heavier. Inside, excitement filled the room. The first mystery had fallen, but a second killer was still waiting to be discovered. And this next murder would prove far more challenging than the last. Chapter 4. The Second Impossible Murder. For several minutes after the first mystery had been solved, the sitting room buzzed with excitement. Raymond could not stop smiling. David Collins still appeared amazed that such a simple explanation had escaped everyone. Margaret Wells looked thoughtful, replaying Miss Marple's reasoning in her mind. Only Professor Hart seemed completely unsurprised. He sat comfortably beside the fireplace, watching the reactions of the others with quiet amusement. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily. The cottage felt warm and safe, making the discussion of murder seem strangely pleasant. Finally, Raymond turned toward the professor. Well, Professor, I believe you've lost the first challenge. Professor Hart laughed. Perhaps. No perhaps about it. Raymond pointed toward his aunt. Miss Marple defeated us all. The professor nodded respectfully. Indeed she did. He looked at Miss Marple. But I wonder whether she will find the solution to my second mystery quite so easily. Miss Marple smiled. My dear Professor, life has taught me never to be overconfident. An excellent philosophy. David leaned forward eagerly. Let's hear the second case. Margaret nodded. Yes, this one is supposed to be more difficult. Professor Hart's expression became serious. I assure you it is. The room grew quiet. The professor folded his hands. The second case concerns a man named Victor Langley. Who was he? Joan asked. A famous artist. Margaret immediately recognized the name. I've heard of him. Most people had. The professor nodded. Victor Langley was one of the most celebrated painters in England. Successful? Asked Raymond. Very. The professor paused. Successful, wealthy, talented, and extremely unpopular. Everyone looked surprised. Why unpopular? David asked. Because he enjoyed making enemies. A few people laughed. The professor continued. Langley was arrogant, argumentative, and often cruel. That usually creates enemies, Miss Marple observed. Precisely, the professor nodded. He had spent years insulting colleagues, cheating business partners, breaking promises, and interfering in other people's affairs. David whistled softly. Not a wise way to live. No, Professor Hart agreed. By the time of his death, many people disliked him. Margaret smiled slightly. Which means many suspects. Exactly. The professor settled deeper into his chair. The murder occurred during a weekend house party at Blackwood Hall. The room listened attentively. Blackwood Hall belonged to a wealthy collector named Charles Ashford. A collector of art, Joan asked. Yes. He invited several guests for a private gathering. The professor began listing them. Victor Langley, Charles Ashford, a rival artist named Simon Drake, Victor's fiancée, Eleanor Price, a former business partner named George Mercer, a cousin named Richard Langley, and a family friend named Henry Blake. Miss Marple quietly memorized every name. There were 7 people staying in the house altogether. The professor nodded. Correct. What happened? Raymond asked. Professor Hart's voice lowered slightly. On the final evening of the gathering, several guests witnessed a heated argument. Between whom? Margaret asked. Victor Langley and George Mercer, the former business partner. Yes. What were they arguing about? No one knew exactly. The professor paused. But the argument was severe. David nodded. A useful motive. There were many motives. Professor Hart smiled. The next morning, one of the servants made a terrible discovery. Everyone waited. Victor Langley's body was found beside the lake on the estate. The room became silent. How had he died? Joan asked quietly. He had been struck once on the head with a heavy object. Murder, without question. The professor nodded. The doctor estimated death occurred between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning. David immediately began thinking. A narrow time frame. Yes. The police questioned everyone. And? Professor Hart smiled mysteriously. Every suspect possessed an alibi. A groan escaped Raymond. Not again. The professor laughed. I'm afraid so. Margaret sat forward. Let's hear them. Professor Hart nodded. Simon Drake, the rival artist, claimed he spent the morning painting in a studio. Witnesses? 2 servants saw him there. Margaret nodded. Continue. Eleanor Price, the fiancée, was taking breakfast with several guests. David frowned. Strong alibi. Quite strong, the professor continued. George Mercer was speaking with the estate manager regarding business matters. And witnesses? Several. Raymond sighed. Of course. Professor Hart smiled. Richard Langley, the cousin, was horseback riding. Witnesses? A stable hand, the professor continued. Charles Ashford was meeting a delivery driver. And Henry Blake? The professor paused. Henry Blake was playing cards in the drawing room. Alone? Asked Margaret. No. Professor Hart smiled. With 6 witnesses. The room fell silent. 6? David repeated. Exactly. Professor Hart nodded. 6 people could confirm his presence. Raymond shook his head. Impossible. The police thought so as well. Professor Hart leaned back. Every suspect had an alibi. No murder weapon was found. No fingerprints. No eyewitnesses. No confession. The room became thoughtful. Miss Marple remained silent. The professor continued. Months passed. The investigation stalled. Years passed. Still nothing. Margaret frowned. Nobody was ever charged. No. Professor Hart shook his head. The case officially remains unsolved. Silence filled the room. The rain outside seemed louder now. The mystery felt larger than the first one. More suspects, more motives, more complications. David finally broke the silence. I suspect the business partner. Margaret immediately disagreed. I think it's the fiancé. Why? People often underestimate emotional motives. Raymond considered the problem. What about the rival artist? Professional jealousy, Jones suggested. For the next half hour, theories filled the room. Each suspect was discussed, each motive examined, each alibi challenged, yet every explanation seemed flawed. Whenever one possibility appeared promising, another detail destroyed it. Gradually, frustration began to appear. David eventually threw up his hands. I have no idea. Margaret laughed. Neither do I. Raymond looked toward Miss Marple. She sat quietly knitting once again. The same calm expression rested upon her face. Professor Hart noticed it too. His eyes twinkled. Miss Marple? The old lady looked up. Yes, Professor? Have you reached a conclusion? Everyone immediately turned toward her. The room became silent. Miss Marple carefully placed her knitting in her lap. Then she smiled. As a matter of fact, I believe I have. Professor Hart raised an eyebrow. So quickly? It is only a possibility. Let us hear it. Miss Marple glanced around the room. Then she spoke words that instantly surprised everyone. I believe Henry Blake was the murderer. The room exploded with disbelief. David stared. Margaret blinked. Raymond nearly dropped his coffee cup. The family friend, he exclaimed. The man with 6 witnesses. Miss Marple nodded calmly. Yes. Professor Hart smiled slowly. A very interesting smile. The smile of a man who suspected another impossible mystery was about to be solved. Chapter 5. Miss Marple's Strange Suspicion. For several moments after Miss Marple named Henry Blake as the murderer, nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was the steady rain tapping against the cottage windows and the crackling of the fire. David Collins stared at her. Henry Blake? Yes, said Miss Marple calmly. The man with the strongest alibi? Indeed. Margaret Wells looked equally surprised. That makes no sense. Raymond laughed. It never makes sense at first. Professor Hart remained silent. His expression revealed nothing. Miss Marple noticed. She suspected she was moving in the correct direction. David leaned forward. I don't understand. Miss Marple smiled gently. My dear Mr. Collins, that is because you are concentrating on facts. Facts are usually important. Very important. She nodded. But human nature is often more important. The room became quiet. Margaret looked interested. You think Henry Blake's behavior tells us something? Exactly. Miss Marple folded her hands. The strongest clue in this case is not a fingerprint, a footprint, or a weapon. What is it? Joan asked. The alibi. Everyone exchanged puzzled looks. The alibi proves he's innocent, David said. Does it? Miss Marple smiled. It proves only that he wanted everyone to believe he was innocent. Professor Hart's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting, Miss Marple continued. Consider the situation. She looked around the room. Every suspect possesses an alibi. Correct. But Henry Blake's alibi is different. How? Margaret asked. He has 6 witnesses. David shrugged. That's simply good luck. I do not believe in such luck, Miss Marple replied softly. The room remained silent. She continued. Most innocent people do not spend their time constructing impressive alibis. What do they do? Raymond asked. They simply live their lives. Margaret nodded slowly. But guilty people worry. Exactly. Miss Marple smiled. Guilty people often work very hard to appear innocent. Professor Hart nodded thoughtfully. Miss Marple continued. I once knew a gentleman in St. Mary Mead who stole money from the Church Restoration Fund. The others smiled. They had learned that village stories usually contained important lessons. What happened? Joan asked. The money disappeared, and everyone suspected him. No. Miss Marple shook her head. He made certain nobody would suspect him. David looked curious. How? He repeatedly mentioned where he had been. Margaret smiled. Too many explanations. Precisely. Miss Marple nodded. Every conversation included another witness, another confirmation, another detail. And that made you suspicious. It made me curious. The old lady smiled. A truly innocent person rarely feels the need to advertise innocence. Professor Hart quietly sipped his coffee. He still said nothing. Miss Marple noticed. That silence encouraged her. She continued. Henry Blake reminds me of that gentleman. The same pattern? Margaret asked. Very much so. David frowned. But 6 witnesses are 6 witnesses. Are they? Miss Marple asked. The barrister looked puzzled. What do you mean? Miss Marple smiled. My dear Mr. Collins, let us examine them carefully. She looked toward Professor Hart. The 6 witnesses saw Henry Blake playing cards. Yes. For the entire morning? The professor hesitated. No. The room immediately became still. Miss Marple noticed the hesitation. A tiny detail, yet often tiny details mattered most. Margaret sat forward. They only saw him occasionally. Professor Hart nodded. That is correct. The journalist's eyes widened. David looked confused. What difference does that make? Miss Marple answered. A very large difference, she continued calmly. If 6 people each see a man for 2 minutes, they may all swear he was present. But he wasn't necessarily there the entire time. Raymond nodded slowly. I see. Professor Hart smiled faintly. Miss Marple continued. House parties are busy places. People come and go. Conversations begin and end. Attention wanders. The room listened carefully. A clever person could disappear briefly. David stared. You think Henry left the room? I think it is possible. How long would he need? Professor Hart answered. The lake was only a short distance from the house. Miss Marple looked at him. 10 minutes? Approximately. Margaret suddenly became excited. Long enough. Exactly. Miss Marple nodded. A short absence might easily go unnoticed. David was beginning to understand. So the alibi isn't as strong as it appears. No, it only appears strong. Professor Hart smiled again. Miss Marple could tell she was moving closer to the truth. She continued. Now we must ask another question. What question? Joan asked. Why would Henry Blake kill Victor Langley? The room became thoughtful. Everyone remembered the known motives. The rival artist had jealousy. The fiancé had emotional reasons. The business partner had financial disputes. The cousin had inheritance concerns. But Henry Blake seemed different. Margaret frowned. Professor, what was Henry Blake's motive? Professor Hart shrugged. The police never discovered one. Miss Marple smiled. There was one. The professor raised an eyebrow. What kind? The kind people often overlook. The room became silent. Miss Marple spoke carefully. Money. David laughed. Money is always useful. Indeed. Miss Marple nodded. But not simple greed. She paused. Desperation. Professor Hart's expression changed slightly. Only slightly. But Miss Marple noticed, and so did Margaret. The journalist immediately sat straighter. You think he was in debt? Miss Marple smiled. A possibility. Professor Hart remained silent. That silence was becoming more revealing with every minute. Miss Marple continued. People in financial trouble become frightened. They hide things. They take risks. And when exposure threatens them, they sometimes panic. The room listened closely. You believe Victor discovered something? Margaret asked. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. Victor Langley appears to have enjoyed involving himself in other people's affairs. Professor Hart smiled. That is true, the old lady continued. Perhaps he learned something dangerous. Something involving Henry Blake. David leaned forward. Financial fraud. Possibly. The room grew silent again. The theory suddenly felt real. Not merely possible. Plausible. Miss Marple folded her hands. Imagine a man drowning in debt. He fears ruin. He fears disgrace. Then someone threatens to expose him. She paused. What might such a man do? Nobody answered. The answer was obvious. Professor Hart slowly stood and walked toward the fireplace. The others watched him. He stared into the flames for several seconds. Then he turned around. His face carried the expression of a man who had just witnessed something remarkable. Miss Marple. Yes, Professor. I believe you have identified the correct suspect. The room erupted. David stared in disbelief. Margaret smiled triumphantly. Raymond laughed loudly. I knew it. Professor Hart raised a hand. However, the room became quiet again. There is still one important clue nobody has discussed. Everyone looked at him. A clue found beside the lake. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. A forgotten clue, a hidden piece of the puzzle, and she suspected it might reveal exactly how Henry Blake's carefully constructed alibi had concealed a murder. Chapter 6. The Clue Beside the Lake. The room fell silent once again. Professor Hart stood beside the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. The dancing flames illuminated his thoughtful face. Everyone was waiting. Miss Marple had identified Henry Blake as the most likely murderer. Now a forgotten clue had emerged. A clue discovered beside the lake where Victor Langley had died. Raymond leaned forward eagerly. Well, Professor? Professor Hart smiled. Near the body, police discovered a broken pocket watch. A pocket watch? Margaret asked. Yes, the professor nodded. It was lying among the reeds near the edge of the lake. David frowned. Did it belong to Victor Langley? That was the original assumption. The professor paused. But investigators later learned it did not. The room became quiet. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly. Incorrect assumptions had solved the first mystery. Perhaps they would solve this one as well. Who did it belong to? Joan asked. Professor Hart smiled. That question was never fully answered. Margaret frowned. Surely the owner could be identified. Normally, yes. The professor nodded. Unfortunately, the watch had been badly damaged. How badly? Raymond asked. The case was broken. The initials were scratched. The mechanism was destroyed. The professor returned to his chair. The only thing investigators knew was that someone had lost it during a struggle. Miss Marple immediately looked interested. A struggle? Yes. The reeds near the body had been disturbed. So Victor fought back. Exactly. David nodded. Then the watch belonged to the killer. A reasonable conclusion. Professor Hart smiled. Yet the police could never prove it. Miss Marple remained silent. She was thinking, very carefully. Professor Hart continued. Years later, a retired detective reviewing the case discovered something peculiar. What? Margaret asked. Several pieces of the watch were missing. The journalist frowned. Missing? Yes. The detective believed somebody returned to the scene. The room became still. To remove evidence, David said. Precisely. Professor Hart nodded. The watch originally consisted of several broken pieces. When police searched the area, only one fragment remained. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. The clue suddenly became very interesting. Raymond noticed. You have an idea, Aunt Jane? Possibly. Professor Hart smiled. Please continue. Miss Marple folded her hands. The missing pieces suggest panic. The room remained silent. Professor Hart nodded slowly. Go on. A careful murderer would remove all evidence immediately. True, but this person left the watch behind. Margaret nodded. Which means the loss was accidental. Exactly. Miss Marple smiled. The watch was dropped during a sudden confrontation. David was listening intently now, and later the killer realized what had happened. Yes, he returned, but could not recover everything. Miss Marple nodded. Correct. Professor Hart's smile widened. The old lady continued. This tells us something important about the killer. What? Joan asked. He was not planning murder far in advance. The room became quiet. Margaret looked puzzled. Why not? Because careful planners rarely panic. Miss Marple replied softly. They prepare. They think ahead. They eliminate risks. She paused. This murder appears different. Professor Hart nodded approvingly. Miss Marple continued. The killer seems frightened. Desperate. Under pressure. David suddenly remembered their earlier discussion. Financial trouble. Exactly. Miss Marple smiled. The pieces were beginning to fit together. A man drowning in debt. A man facing exposure. A man who suddenly sees his future collapsing. The room listened carefully. Such a person may act impulsively. Margaret nodded. He doesn't plan murder. He reacts. Precisely. Miss Marple folded her hands again. I believe Victor Langley discovered something. Something dangerous. Something involving Henry Blake. Professor Hart remained silent. The silence itself was becoming confirmation. Raymond smiled. You've practically solved the entire case. Not quite, Miss Marple replied. There is still one question. David nodded. How exactly did the murder happen? Professor Hart looked interested. An excellent question. Miss Marple thought for a moment, then she spoke. I imagine Victor arranged a private meeting. The room listened closely. With Henry Blake? Yes, Miss Marple nodded. Perhaps beside the lake. Why there? Joan asked. A quiet location. A private conversation. The old lady smiled. People often choose beautiful places for unpleasant discussions. Margaret laughed softly. That's true, Miss Marple continued. Victor confronts Henry. He reveals what he knows. Financial fraud, perhaps. Or embezzlement. The room remained silent. Henry realizes exposure is inevitable. David nodded. He panics. Exactly, Miss Marple continued. The argument becomes heated. Victor refuses to remain silent. Henry loses control. She paused. Then he strikes. The room was completely silent now. The murder scene seemed almost visible. The quiet lake. The morning mist. Two men arguing. One desperate. One confident. Then sudden violence. Professor Hart nodded. The medical evidence supports that theory. Miss Marple smiled. The watch breaks during the struggle. Yes. The killer returns to the house. He resumes his card game. Exactly. The professor nodded. Margaret shook her head. Remarkable. David laughed. The strongest alibi was actually the most suspicious. Miss Marple smiled. People often hide things in plain sight. Professor Hart rose once more. There was admiration in his expression now. Genuine admiration. I should like to reveal the official solution. Everyone turned toward him. The retired detective eventually discovered that Henry Blake had indeed been heavily in debt. Raymond grinned. Of course, the professor continued. Victor Langley had uncovered evidence of financial fraud. Margaret smiled triumphantly. And threatened exposure. Yes. Professor Hart nodded. Several witnesses later recalled overhearing part of an argument between them. Miss Marple quietly resumed her knitting. The others watched in amazement. The second impossible murder had almost been solved. Not through fingerprints, not through scientific analysis, not through hidden documents, but through observation. Simple observation. The kind Miss Marple practiced every day in St. Mary Mead. Professor Hart smiled. There remains only one final piece of the story. Everyone looked at him. The confession. The room became silent. At last they were about to learn exactly how the mystery ended, and how Miss Marple had once again uncovered the truth, hidden behind appearances. Chapter 7. The Confession and the Lesson. The cottage sitting room had become completely silent. Outside, the rain was finally beginning to ease. The storm that had accompanied the evening's mysteries seemed to be slowly passing. Inside, everyone sat focused on Professor Hart. The solution to the second murder now appeared clear. Miss Marple had identified Henry Blake as the killer. She had explained the weakness of his alibi. She had uncovered the likely motive. She had even reconstructed the crime itself. Only one piece remained, the confession. Professor Hart stood near the fireplace and looked around the room. I must admit, he said, I did not expect anyone to solve both cases. Raymond laughed. You clearly underestimated my aunt. I certainly did. The professor smiled. Miss Marple blushed slightly. You are all being very kind. Professor Hart shook his head. No, Miss Marple. We are simply being honest. The others nodded in agreement. The professor continued. The official solution emerged almost 8 years after Victor Langley's death. Margaret leaned forward. What happened? A retired detective reopened the case. Why? Because he never believed the original investigation had reached the truth. The room listened carefully. The detective reviewed every witness statement, every report, every piece of evidence, and eventually he discovered something. David nodded. The financial problems. Exactly. Professor Hart smiled. Henry Blake's debts were far worse than anyone had realized. How bad? Joan asked. Catastrophic. The professor paused. He owed money to several creditors. He had secretly borrowed large sums. He had made a series of disastrous investments. The room grew quiet. Margaret nodded. Desperation. Precisely, Professor Hart continued. The detective discovered that Victor Langley had learned about the fraud several weeks before the murder. Miss Marple smiled softly. The pattern had been exactly as she suspected. Victor intended to expose him? Raymond asked. Yes, the professor nodded. He possessed documents proving Henry had manipulated financial accounts. David frowned. That would ruin him. It would, Professor Hart replied, financially, socially, professionally. The room remained silent. Everyone understood. For a desperate man, exposure could seem worse than prison. The professor continued. According to letters discovered years later, Victor arranged a private meeting beside the lake on the morning of his death. Margaret exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Another confirmation. What happened during the meeting? Joan asked quietly. No one knows the exact words. The professor paused, but investigators reconstructed the likely conversation. He stared briefly into the fire. Victor confronted Henry. He presented the evidence. He demanded explanations. The room remained silent. Henry denied everything. But Victor refused to remain silent. Professor Hart folded his arms. The argument became increasingly heated. Eventually, Victor threatened to go directly to the authorities. David nodded. The breaking point. Exactly, the professor continued. Henry panicked. He grabbed a heavy walking stick and struck Victor. The room became still. The murder suddenly felt less like a puzzle and more like a tragedy. A moment of fear, a moment of anger, a moment that destroyed 2 lives. Professor Hart continued. Victor collapsed. The struggle broke Henry's pocket watch. The watch fell into the reeds. Henry fled. Margaret shook her head slowly. Then he returned to the card game. Yes. The professor nodded. He resumed playing cards as though nothing had happened. David sighed, and everyone remembered seeing him. Exactly. Professor Hart smiled faintly. The perfect alibi. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. The apparently perfect alibi. The professor laughed. Quite right. The room relaxed slightly. The mystery was finally complete. Yet Professor Hart was not finished. The confession came years later. Everyone looked interested again. How? Raymond asked. Professor Hart sat down. Henry Blake became seriously ill. A few months before his death. The room listened carefully. He asked to see a solicitor, a priest, and the retired detective. Margaret's eyes widened. He confessed? Completely. Professor Hart nodded. He admitted everything. He described the argument. He described the murder. He described returning later to recover pieces of the broken watch. The room became silent. He could not find every fragment. Miss Marple nodded. The missing piece. Exactly. Professor Hart smiled. The tiny clue that continued troubling investigators. For several moments nobody spoke. The mystery had ended. The killer had been identified. The confession had confirmed everything. Finally David turned toward Miss Marple. I still don't understand something. What is that? She asked. How did you solve it so quickly? Margaret laughed. Yes, I would like to know as well. Raymond smiled. I've been asking that question for years. Everyone looked toward Miss Marple. The old lady placed her knitting aside. Then she smiled. My dear friends, there is nothing remarkable about it. The room immediately laughed. Professor Hart shook his head. There is something remarkable about it. Miss Marple ignored him. The answer is actually very simple. What is it? Joan asked. Miss Marple looked toward the rain-covered window. I have spent most of my life observing people. She paused. People are surprisingly alike. David looked doubtful. Surely murderers are different. Oh no, Miss Marple smiled. They imagine they are different. The room laughed again. She continued, I once knew a village treasurer who stole money. He behaved exactly like Henry Blake. Not in details, but in character. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. The same fears, the same excuses, the same desperation. Exactly. Miss Marple smiled. Human nature changes very little. The room became thoughtful. Professor Hart slowly nodded. I believe that is the secret. What secret? Raymond asked. Why Miss Marple succeeds. The professor looked toward her. Most people study crimes. Miss Marple studies people. The room fell silent. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Margaret smiled. I think that's the best explanation we've heard all evening. The others agreed. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Moonlight appeared between the clouds. The two impossible murders had been solved. Yet the greatest mystery, as always, remained the same. The mystery of human nature. And no one understood that mystery better than Miss Jane Marple. Chapter 8. The Queen of Observation. The grandfather clock in the corner of Miss Marple's sitting room struck midnight. The deep chimes echoed softly through the cottage. For a few moments nobody spoke. The evening had begun as a pleasant gathering among friends. It had become a contest of deduction. Now it had ended with the solution of two seemingly impossible murders. Outside, the storm had passed completely. Moonlight bathed the village of St. Mary Mead in silver light. Inside, the atmosphere had become relaxed and cheerful once more. Raymond stretched comfortably in his chair. Well, he said, smiling, I think we can safely declare a winner. Everyone laughed. Professor Hart raised his hands in surrender. I admit defeat. Miss Marple looked embarrassed. My dear Professor, there was no competition. There most certainly was. The professor smiled. And I lost. David Collins shook his head. I still cannot believe how quickly you identified both killers. Margaret Wells nodded in agreement. The clues were there. We all heard them. Yet none of us reached the same conclusions. Miss Marple smiled gently. Perhaps because you were looking in the wrong direction. Professor Hart laughed. Exactly what she said during the first mystery, and exactly what proved true. The group sat quietly for a moment. The fire had burned lower now, casting a warm golden glow across the room. Joan poured fresh coffee for everyone. The comforting smell filled the cottage. Raymond raised his cup. A toast. Everyone looked toward him. To Aunt Jane. The others immediately lifted their cups. To Miss Marple. The elderly lady blushed slightly. You are all very kind. No, Margaret replied. "We are simply impressed." Professor Hart smiled. "I have spent many years studying criminal cases. I have lectured on them, written about them, analyzed them." He shook his head. "And yet you solved both mysteries in a single evening." Miss Marple laughed softly. "My dear Professor, you make it sound far more impressive than it really is." David smiled. "Only because you make it look easy." The room filled with laughter again. After a few moments, Professor Hart became thoughtful. "There is one thing I should like to know." "What is that?" Miss Marple asked. The professor leaned forward. "When did you first suspect Henry Blake?" Miss Marple considered the question. Almost immediately, the room erupted with surprise. "Immediately!" Margaret exclaimed. "Good heavens!" Miss Marple nodded. "The moment I heard about the 6 witnesses." David stared. "That was the clue?" "It was." The barrister looked puzzled. "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "Because it sounded too perfect." The room became quiet. She continued. "In my experience, perfection is often suspicious." Professor Hart nodded. "A very wise observation." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Life is untidy. People are untidy. Real events are untidy." She smiled. "When something appears unusually neat, I become curious." Margaret laughed. "That sounds exactly like a detective." "Oh dear," said Miss Marple. "I hope not." Everyone laughed. The old lady continued. "I merely pay attention." The professor shook his head. "That is precisely what detectives do." Raymond smiled. "Better than most detectives." For a while, the conversation drifted away from murder. They discussed books, travel, village gossip, and amusing stories from Raymond's literary career. The tension of the evening slowly disappeared. Eventually, Joan glanced at the clock. "My goodness, it is late." The others looked surprised. None of them had noticed the passing hours. The mysteries had completely absorbed their attention. Professor Hart stood first. "I believe we should allow Miss Marple some rest." "A sensible suggestion," said Margaret. Everyone rose from their chairs. Good nights were exchanged. The guests disappeared upstairs one by one. Soon, only Raymond and Miss Marple remained in the sitting room. The fire was nearly out now. The cottage felt peaceful again. Raymond smiled at his aunt. "You enjoyed yourself tonight." Miss Marple returned the smile. "I did. I could tell." Raymond walked toward the window. Moonlight illuminated the quiet village street. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "people always underestimate you." Miss Marple laughed. "That has often proved useful." Raymond nodded. "Professor Hart certainly underestimated you. He was very kind." "No," Raymond smiled. "He genuinely believed nobody could solve both cases." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "People often believe mysteries are complicated. And they aren't? They usually become complicated because people ignore simple facts." Raymond laughed. "That sounds exactly like you." Miss Marple rose from her chair. Together they extinguished the remaining lamps. The cottage grew darker. Only moonlight remained. "Good night, Aunt Jane." "Good night, Raymond." They climbed the stairs. Soon the cottage was completely quiet. The next morning dawned bright and beautiful. The storm had vanished entirely. Sunlight poured across St. Mary Mead. Birds sang in the hedges. The air smelled fresh and clean after the night's rain. Miss Marple was already awake. As always, she preferred early mornings. She stepped into her garden carrying a small basket and a pair of gardening gloves. The roses sparkled with dew. The flowers looked healthier than ever. Miss Marple smiled. Gardens made sense. People did not always make sense. Yet somehow, she had spent much of her life understanding both. A short time later, the guests emerged from the cottage. Breakfast was served outdoors beneath the warm sunshine. Everyone seemed cheerful. The previous evening's mysteries remained the main topic of conversation. Professor Hart approached Miss Marple before departure. "I have learned an important lesson." "Oh?" she asked. The professor smiled. "Never challenge Miss Marple to solve a mystery." The group burst into laughter. Miss Marple laughed as well. "I think that is a very wise lesson." Soon luggage was loaded into the automobile. Goodbyes were exchanged. Promises were made to visit again. Finally, the motorcar pulled away from the cottage. Miss Marple stood at the gate waving until it disappeared around a bend in the road. The village became quiet once more. The mystery weekend was over. The guests were gone. The 2 killers had been identified. The impossible murders had been solved. Miss Marple returned slowly to her roses. As she began trimming a flower bush, She reflected upon the previous evening, human nature. That had always been the real mystery. Not locked rooms, not missing clues, not perfect alibis. People, their fears, their ambitions, their secrets. Those were the things that truly mattered. A robin landed nearby and began searching for worms among the flower beds. Miss Marple smiled. "Well," she said softly, "I suspect there will be another mystery someday." The robin tilted its head as if listening, and in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead, Miss Jane Marple returned to her garden, content in the knowledge that no mystery was ever truly impossible for someone willing to observe carefully.
If you enjoy our story, then like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.